There was a man who used to come into a place I worked, a small restaurant where I washed dishes and sometimes helped in the kitchen when they needed an extra pair of hands. This was years ago, in a town I don't remember the name of anymore. One of those places you pass through and work for a while and then move on from. The restaurant was nothing special, just a counter with stools and a few tables. The kind of place that served breakfast and lunch to people who worked nearby or who were traveling through and needed something quick and cheap. The man came in almost every day, always at the same time, around 11 in the morning, after the breakfast crowd had cleared out but before the lunch rush started. He'd sit at the counter, always the same stool, third one from the left, and he'd order the same thing every time: coffee and a sandwich, ham and cheese, usually, sometimes turkey if they were out of ham. He never said much, just gave his order in a quiet voice, and then sat there waiting, looking at nothing in particular, his hands folded on the counter in front of him. When the food came, he'd eat slowly, methodically, not like he was savoring it, but not like he was rushing either, just eating in a steady rhythm. And when he was done, he'd drink his coffee, also slowly holding the cup with both hands, like he was trying to warm them even though it was uncold inside. I'd see him through the window in the kitchen door, see him sitting there at the counter while I washed dishes or prepped vegetables or did whatever else needed doing. And after a while, I started to notice things about him, small things, the way you do when you see someone regularly and there's not much else to pay attention to. I noticed he always wore the same jacket, a brown canvas thing that had seen better days, worn at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs. I noticed his hands were rough and scarred, the hands of someone who worked with them, who did hard physical labor for a living. I noticed he never talked to anyone else in the restaurant, never struck up conversations with the other customers or the waitress who served him. He'd answer if someone spoke to him, give a nod or a word or two, but he never initiated anything, never seemed interested in connecting with anyone. And I noticed the waitress, a young woman named Marie or Mary or something like that. She'd try sometimes to get him talking, ask him how his day was going, or comment on the weather, or mention something that had happened in town. And he'd respond politely, but briefly, and after a while, she stopped trying. Just brought him his food and his coffee and left him alone. I watched him for weeks, months maybe, watched him come in and sit and eat and drink his coffee and leave. Always the same routine. Always at the same time, always alone. And I started to feel like I knew him, or at least knew something about him, even though we'd never spoken, even though I didn't know his name, or where he lived, or what he did for work. I knew he was alone, knew he was quiet, knew he was someone who kept to himself, not because he was unfriendly, but because that was just who he was, someone who didn't need or want much interaction with other people. There was something about his presence that was calming, I think. Something about the way he occupied space without demanding attention. The way he was just there, consistent and predictable, a fixed point in the chaos of the restaurant. The constant flow of people coming and going, ordering and eating and leaving. He was like a piece of furniture almost, something you noticed when you first started working there, but then stopped noticing because it was always there, always the same. But I did notice him, kept noticing him, and I think that was because there was something in his quietness that I recognized, something familiar, like looking in a mirror and seeing a version of yourself, not exactly the same, but close enough to feel a connection. I was quiet too back then, didn't talk much to the other people I worked with, kept to myself, did my job, and went home and didn't make friends or get involved in anyone's life. So maybe I saw something of myself in him, or maybe I just respected the way he moved through the world, taking up as little space as possible, not bothering anyone, not expecting anything from anyone. I remember once I was taking trash out to the dumpster in the alley behind the restaurant, and I saw him walking past at the end of the alley, heading toward wherever he went after he finished his lunch. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his head down, not hurrying but not dawdling either, just walking at a steady pace. And I watched him until he turned a corner and disappeared from view. And I wondered where he was going, what he did for the rest of the day, where he lived, if he had family or friends, or if he was as alone as he seemed. But I never asked, never tried to find out, never even spoke to him, except maybe to nod if our eyes happened to meet through the kitchen window. And he never spoke to me either, probably didn't even know I existed, didn't know I was watching him, noticing him, thinking about him. And that was fine, that was how it should be, I think. Some connections exist without acknowledgement, without words. Just two people occupying the same space at the same time, aware of each other in some peripheral way, but not needing anything more than that. I worked at that restaurant for about 6 months, maybe a little longer, and in all that time, the man came in almost every day, so regular you could set a clock by him. There were only a few times he didn't show up. And when that happened, I'd notice his absence, notice the empty stool at the counter, and I'd wonder if he was sick, or if something had happened, or if he'd just decided to eat somewhere else that day. But he'd always show up the next day or the day after, back to his routine, back to his stool and his sandwich and his coffee. And then I left, got a job somewhere else, moved on the way I always moved on. I didn't say goodbye to anyone at the restaurant, didn't tell them I was leaving, just stopped showing up one day, and that was it. And I thought about the man sometimes after I left. Wondered if he still came in every day at 11, still sat at the same stool, still ordered the same thing. I wondered if anyone else noticed him the way I had, if the other workers ever thought about him, or if he was just part of the background, invisible in his consistency. Years later, I don't know why, but I thought about him again. About that quiet man at the counter with his sandwich and coffee. And I realized I'd learned something from watching him. Something about how to be in the world, how to exist without needing validation or attention or connection. He was complete in himself, I think. Didn't need other people to tell him who he was or what he was worth. Didn't need conversation or companionship to feel like his life had meaning. He just was, just existed, just moved through his days, doing what he did, and that was enough. And I think that's rare, that kind of self-sufficiency, that ability to be alone without being lonely, to be quiet without being empty. Most people need something from other people, need attention or approval or company, need to feel seen and heard and acknowledged. But this man didn't seem to need any of that, or if he did, he'd learned to live without it. And there was a kind of dignity in that. A kind of strength. I don't know what happened to him. Don't know if he est still alive, or if he est still in that town, or if he still goes to that restaurant for lunch every day. But I remember him, remember his presence, remember the way he sat at that counter day after day, year after year. Probably just being who he was not, trying to be anything else, not apologizing for his quietness or his solitude. And I'm grateful I got to see that, got to witness that particular way of being in the world. Even if we never spoke, even if he never knew I was watching. Even if I never knew his name. There was a woman I used to see almost every morning when I was living in a city, one of those times when I had steady work and a room and a routine that lasted longer than a few weeks or months. I'd leave for work early, around 6, when the streets were still mostly empty and the sun was just starting to come up, and I'd walk to the place where I worked, a factory about 20 minutes away on foot. The route took me through a park, nothing fancy, just a square of grass with some trees and benches, a path cutting through the middle, and every morning, almost without fail, the woman would be sitting on one of the benches near the path, always the same bench, facing east where the sun came up. She'd be there when I walked through, sitting with her hands in her lap, just sitting, not reading or eating or doing anything, just sitting and looking at the sunrise or the trees or whatever was in front of her. She was older, maybe in her 60s or 70s, hard to tell exactly. With gray hair she kept short and practical, and she dressed simply a coat in cold weather, a sweater when it was warmer, always neat and clean, but nothing fancy, nothing that drew attention. And she had this quality about her, this stillness, like she was part of the bench or part of the park, like she'd been there forever and would be there forever, unchanging and constant. The first few times I walked past her, I didn't really notice her, or I noticed her the way you notice a tree or a building, just part of the landscape, something that's there. But after a while, I started to actually see her, started to register that she was there every morning, And once I'd noticed that I couldn't not notice, couldn't walk past without being aware of her presence. I started nodding to her when I passed, just a small acknowledgement, the kind of greeting you give to someone you see regularly but don't really know. And she'd nod back, a tiny movement of her head, barely perceptible, but enough to let me know she'd seen me too, that she was aware of this small ritual we'd fallen into. And that was it. That was the extent of our interaction. Just nods, no words, no smiles even, just this minimal acknowledgement that we both existed and occupied the same space at the same time each day. I found myself looking forward to seeing her, to that moment of passing and nodding, and I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe it was just nice to have something consistent, something I could count on, a small point of connection in a life that often felt disconnected and adrift. Or maybe it was something about her, specifically about the way she sat there so peacefully, so contentedly, like she didn't need anything or want anything. Like sitting on that bench, watching the morning was enough, was all she needed from life. Sometimes I'd wonder about her, about who she was, and what her life was like. Did she live nearby? Did she have family, children, grandchildren? Was she widowed, retired? What did she do for the rest of the day after sitting on that bench in the morning? Did she have hobbies, friends, a routine that extended beyond this morning ritual? But I never asked, never tried to find out, never even said hello or good morning, just kept up the nodding, the silent acknowledgement. And I think that was right. That was what the situation called for. Some connections are meant to stay small and undefined, meant to exist in silence without being explained or expanded or turned into something they're not. Winter came and it got cold, really cold, the kind of cold that makes you question why anyone would choose to live in a place where the air hurts your face. And still, she was there every morning on her bench, bundled up in a heavy coat and a scarf and gloves, but there, sitting in the cold, dark morning, watching the sun come up. And I'd walk past and nod, and she'd nod back, and there was something comforting about that. About the fact that even the weather couldn't disrupt this routine, could unkeep either of us from being where we were supposed to be at the time we were supposed to be there. One morning it was snowing, light flakes falling slow and lazy, and the park was covered in white everything, quiet and muffled. And I walked through it the same as always, and there she was on her bench with snow accumulating on her shoulders and her lap, and I almost stopped, almost said something, almost asked if she was all right, if she needed anything, if she wanted to go somewhere warm. But I didn't, just nodded like always and kept walking. And she nodded back, and that was that. Spring came eventually, and the snow melted, and the trees in the park started to green up, and the mornings got lighter and warmer. And still, we continued our routine, her sitting on the bench, me walking past, the nods exchanged, nothing changing, nothing needing to change. And I felt a kind of affection for her, I think. this woman I didn't know, this stranger who was somehow not a stranger, because we'd shared this small thing for so long, this daily moment of acknowledgement. I must have seen her hundreds of times over the year or so that I walked through that park every morning. Hundreds of nods, hundreds of moments of silent recognition. And then I changed jobs, took work on the other side of the city. And my route changed, and I didn't go through the park anymore. Didn't walk past that bench, didn't see her. And I missed it, missed that moment in the morning, missed seeing her there in her spot, so constant and reliable. I thought about going back sometimes, walking through the park, even though it was out of my way, just to see if she was still there, just to nod to her one more time. But I never did. Told myself it didn't matter. Told myself it was just a small thing that had ended, and there was no point trying to hold on to it. But I think about her sometimes, wonder if she's still there, still sitting on that bench every morning watching the sunrise. Wonder if she noticed when I stopped coming through, if she missed the nod the way I missed giving it. Wonder if someone else walks through now and nods to her, if she's formed that same small connection with someone new, or if maybe she's not there anymore. If she moved away, or got sick, or died, if that bench sits empty now in the mornings with no one to occupy it, I'll never know. And that's all right. That's how these things go sometimes. People come into your life in small ways, and then they leave. And you never get the full story, never get closure or explanation or goodbye. You just have the memory of what was, the memory of those nods in the park, those moments of silent connection. And that has to be enough, because that's all there is. But it was something, those mornings, that routine, that woman on that bench. It mattered, even if it was small, even if it never grew into anything more. It was a point of light in the darkness, a moment of recognition, a reminder that other people existed, and that sometimes you could acknowledge each other without words, without demands, without needing anything except to be seen for a second, and then allowed to continue on your way. I had a conversation once that I still think about, even though it was barely a conversation at all, just a few words exchanged on a rainy afternoon. This was in a different city, a different time, when I was working at a garage, doing oil changes and tire rotations, and whatever else needed doing. The work was dirty and hard on the body, but it paid okay, and the boss was decent enough, and I could do it without thinking too much, which was what I needed at that point in my life. There was a man who worked there with me, older than me by a lot, maybe in his 60s, who'd been working at that garage for decades, since before I was born probably. His name was Frank, or Fred, something like that. And he was one of those people who'd been in the same place, doing the same thing for so long that he'd become part of the place, inseparable from it, like he was as much a fixture as the tools on the walls or the lift in the bay. He didn't talk much, this man kept to himself mostly did his work, and went home, and the younger guys who worked there treated him with a kind of careful respect, not because he demanded it, but because he de-earned it just by showing up every day for all those years. He knew everything about cars, could diagnose problems by sound alone, could fix things other mechanics couldn't figure out, and he did it all quietly, efficiently, without making a big deal about it. I worked alongside him for months, and we barely spoke, except about work, about what needed doing, about which tools to use, or how to handle a particular problem. He'd show me things sometimes, how to do something better, or faster, or more carefully. And he'd do it without words, mostly, just demonstrate, and then step back and let me try. And I learned from him, learned a lot, but not through conversation, through observation, through watching how he worked and trying to copy it. One afternoon, we were both working late, staying past closing to finish a job that needed to be done by morning. And it started raining, heavy rain that drummed on the roof of the garage and made it hard to hear anything else. We were the only ones there. Everyone else had gone home, and we worked in silence, except for the rain and the sound of tools and the occasional grunt of effort when something was stuck or heavy. We finished around 7 or 8, later than we'd planned, and we cleaned up and put the tools away and locked up the garage. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by then, lighter, but still steady, and we stood outside the garage door for a minute, both of us tired and dirty, getting our bearings before heading home in different directions. And then he said something. This man who barely ever spoke, he looked at the sky and the rain and said, "Weather like this makes you feel something, doesn't it?" Not a question, just a statement, said in a flat, even voice, like he was commenting on the price of oil or the condition of a tire. I didn't know what to say to that, wasn't sure what he meant exactly, so I just said yes, it does, and he nodded and looked at me for a second, really looked at me, like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. And then he said, "You'll do all right," and he turned and walked away into the rain, headed toward wherever he lived, and that was it. That was the whole conversation. I stood there for a minute after he left, stood in the drizzle, thinking about what he'd said, trying to understand it, trying to figure out what he'd meant by it. Weather like this makes you feel something. You'll do all right. 2 sentences, barely connected, said by a man who rarely spoke, and I didn't know what to make of them, but they stayed with me. Those words stuck in my head and wouldn't leave. I thought about them that night when I got home, thought about them the next day at work, kept thinking about them for days and weeks after. Weather like this makes you feel something. What did that mean? Did he mean it literally? That rain made you feel cold or wet or uncomfortable? Or did he mean something deeper? That weather like that brought up emotions, made you aware of things you usually didn't notice, made you feel alive or sad or grateful or something else entirely? And the other thing, You'll do all right. That seemed clearer, but also not clear at all. Do all right at what? At work, at life, at whatever I was struggling with that he'd somehow noticed, even though I thought I'd been hiding it pretty well. And why had he said it? What had prompted him to speak at all after months of near silence? What had he seen or sensed that made him think I needed to hear those words? I never asked him about it, never brought it up, never tried to get clarification or explanation. The next day at work, we went back to our usual routine of minimal communication, working side by side, but not really talking. And that was fine. That was normal. That was what I expected. And the conversation, if you could call it that, was never mentioned again, never referenced, just disappeared into the past like it had never happened. But it had happened, and it mattered, even though I didn't understand it, even though I couldn't explain why it mattered. Those 2 sentences, said in the rain on a random evening by a man I barely knew but worked with every day, they became something I carried with me, something I turned over in my mind during quiet moments, something I came back to when I was feeling lost or uncertain, or like I didn't know what I was doing with my life. Weather like this makes you feel something. Over time, I came to understand that, or at least I came to understand what it meant to me, which might not be what he meant at all, but that's how it is with words sometimes. They mean one thing to the person who says them and something else to the person who hears them. To me, it came to mean that it's okay to feel things, that being human means being affected by the world around you, by weather and light and sound and all the small details of existence, and that acknowledging those feelings, letting yourself feel them, is important, even if you don't know what to do with them. And you'll do all right. That one took longer to understand. Or maybe I still don't understand it fully. But I came to think he meant that I was going to survive, going to make it through whatever I was going through, going to find my way, even if I didn't know where I was going. And coming from him, from someone who'd worked the same job in the same place for decades, who'd probably seen hundreds of people come through that garage, young guys like me who were just passing through, trying to figure things out, some of whom made it and some of whom didn't. Coming from him, that reassurance meant something. I left that job after about a year, moved on to something else in a different city. I didn't say goodbye to him, didn't thank him for what he'd taught me or for those words in the rain, just stopped showing up one day the way I always did. And I regret that sometimes. Wish I'd at least acknowledged what he'd given me. Even if I couldn't put it into words, even if he would have just shrugged it off and said it was nothing. But I think about him sometimes. Think about that rainy evening and those 2 sentences that seemed so small at the time, but grew larger in memory, took on weight and significance that they didn't have in the moment. And I'm grateful for them, grateful for him, grateful that he spoke when he usually didn't, that he saw something in me that made him think I needed to hear what he had to say, that he took the time to say it, even though it probably cost him something to break his usual silence. That's the thing about words, I think, about conversation, about the small exchanges we have with people we barely know. You never know which ones are going to stick, which ones are going to matter years later, which ones are going to become the things you think about when you read, trying to understand your life and where you've been and how you got from there to here. Most conversations disappear, forgotten as soon as they're over, but some of them stay. Some of them work their way into you and become part of how you see the world, and you unpredict which will be which until time passes and you look back and realize what mattered. The fire's getting low now, just embers glowing in the dark. It's late, later than I realized. And I've been talking a long time, maybe too long. But that's what happens sometimes when you start remembering, when you let yourself go back to those times and those places and those people, the ones who were there and then weren't, the ones who said something or did something or just existed in a way that left a mark. These people I've been talking about. The quiet man at the counter, the woman on the bench, the mechanic in the rain, they're all gone from my life now, have been for years. And I'll probably never see any of them again, never know what happened to them or how their lives turned out. But they're still with me in a way, still present in memory. Still teaching me things, even though they're not here, even though they probably never knew they were teaching me anything at all. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what we leave behind, not grand gestures or important words or dramatic moments, but small things, quiet things, the everyday interactions that do unseem like much at the time, but accumulate over years and become the substance of a life. The nod in the park, the words in the rain, the presence at the counter. These are the things that last, the things that matter, the things worth remembering. The fire's almost out. If you want to come back another night, I'll probably be here. There's usually room by the fire.